The morning light filtered through the tall glass panels of Meridian Tower in a way that made everything inside look expensive. Polished marble floors, brass elevator doors, the faint scent of white tea diffused through a hidden ventilation system. It was the kind of building that had been designed to make certain people feel important and certain others feel small. And every morning, before the important people arrived, Angela Brooks was already there. She was 32 years old, with a quiet face that rarely gave away much of what she was thinking. Her hair was pulled back neatly beneath a dark cap. Her uniform, a steel gray polo shirt and matching trousers, was pressed without a single visible wrinkle. She moved through the lobby with the unhurried focus of someone who took her work seriously, guiding a wide mop in careful, overlapping arcs across the floor. She had been doing this for almost 2 years now, arriving before 6 in the morning, finishing her assigned floors before the first wave of corporate employees streamed through the revolving doors. The building's security guards knew her by name. The lobby concierge always nodded when she came in. But most of the people who walked past her every day, the ones clutching coffee cups, dragging rolling luggage, talking loudly into wireless earpieces, did not appear to notice her at all. There were a few who went out of their way to be kind. A junior analyst from the 4th floor sometimes stopped to say good morning. One of the paralegals on the 11th floor had once brought her a cup of tea during a cold snap in January, pressing the paper cup into her hands with a gentle smile before disappearing into the elevator. Angela had remembered that for a long time. Small gestures had a way of staying with her. But those moments were the exception. The more common experience was invisibility walking through a crowd, as though she occupied a slightly different layer of reality, present but unacknowledged, doing work that everyone needed but few thought about. She did not dwell on it. She had learned long ago that silence could be a kind of armor, and patience could be a kind of power. She kept her head down, did her work, and watched. She had always been a careful observer of human behavior. It was something she had developed out of necessity, growing up in circumstances where reading a room correctly could make a real difference. And after all these years, she had become extraordinarily good at it. What the people of Meridian Tower did not know about Angela Brooks, what not a single employee, security guard, or building concierge had ever been told, was that she was not simply a member of the cleaning staff. She was not, in any conventional sense, an employee of the building at all. Her presence in the lobby each morning was entirely voluntary. She had chosen this. She had arranged it herself, quietly and without fanfare, because she believed that the surest way to understand how a place truly functioned was to occupy its most overlooked corner. And she had been watching for almost 2 years. The information she had gathered in that time was, to her mind, invaluable. Marcus Reed arrived at Meridian Tower every morning at exactly 8:45, never earlier and never later, always through the main entrance, and never through the side door that most people used when they were running behind. Punctuality, in his view, was not merely a virtue, it was a performance. Arriving at the exact right moment, in the exact right way, was part of how he had built his reputation. He was 38 years old, with a kind of sharp, angular features that photographed well, and a posture that communicated authority without effort. He wore tailored suits in charcoal and navy, always with pocket squares that matched nothing, and contrasted with everything. A deliberate choice that he had once explained to an interviewer as controlled asymmetry. He drove a matte black luxury sedan, hired a personal stylist every quarter, and had once fired a junior employee for showing up to a client meeting in shoes he described as the footwear of someone who has stopped trying. His company, Viridian Solutions, occupied 6 floors of Meridian Tower, the 14th through the 19th, and had grown in 4 years from a small software consulting firm into a mid-sized technology company with over 300 employees and contracts with several government agencies. Marcus had built it from almost nothing, and he wanted everyone to know it. He referenced his own origin story with great frequency, how he had started with limited resources, how he had outworked everyone around him, how he had refused to let circumstances define his ceiling. It was a compelling narrative, and he told it well. The problem was that somewhere along the way, the lessons he claimed to have learned from that story had inverted themselves. He had begun as someone who understood what it meant to struggle. He had ended up as someone who used other people's struggle as evidence of their inadequacy. He was charming when it served him, and cutting when it did not. His employees feared him in the particular way that people fear unpredictability not because he was always cruel, but because they never knew when he would be. He had been known to praise someone effusively in a morning meeting and then publicly humiliate that same person by the afternoon for an unrelated misstep. He evaluated people with a speed and finality that left no room for nuance. He looked at a person's car and drew conclusions about their drive. He looked at a person's clothes and drew conclusions about their judgment. He believed, with the kind of conviction that never gets examined, that the world was a meritocracy and that success was always deserved and poverty was always a choice. This belief had become the lens through which he saw everything, and it had made him, in ways he was not yet aware of, profoundly blind. He had little patience for what he called unnecessary people, a category that, in practice, seemed to include anyone who was not immediately useful to him. Building maintenance staff, security guards, food delivery workers, the woman who watered the plants on his floor. These were people whose existence he registered only when something went wrong. He had, on more than one occasion, complained loudly about a slow elevator, a sticky door handle, or a coffee machine that was out of order, directing his frustration not at the machines themselves, but at the nearest human being, as though the inconvenience were a personal affront and the person closest to it were personally responsible. His direct reports had learned to absorb these moments without expression. The support staff had learned to make themselves even more invisible whenever he was nearby, and Angela, who had observed all of this from her quiet corner of the lobby, had catalogued every instance with careful attention. The morning everything changed began like most others. Angela had arrived at 5:58, signed in at the security desk, collected her cart from the supply closet, and begun her rounds on the ground floor. The lobby was quiet at that hour, just the soft hum of the ventilation system and the occasional squeak of her mop against the marble. She worked methodically, the way she always did, moving from the entrance toward the elevator bank and then back toward the reception desk. She had just refreshed the bucket and was working on a particularly stubborn scuff mark near the far wall when she heard the revolving door push open earlier than usual. Marcus Reed walked in with two men she did not recognize, both in expensive suits, both carrying the particular stiffness of people trying to appear at ease. From the way Marcus was speaking expansive, slightly louder than necessary, gesturing with one hand, it was clear these were clients or investors he was trying to impress. He was mid-sentence when he passed within a few feet of Angela's cart. He stopped. His expression shifted. He turned toward her with the slow deliberateness of someone deciding to make a point. "Do you smell that?" he said, not to her, but to the two men beside him. He looked directly at her as he said it. "That's what poverty smells like. Some people just carry it with them wherever they go." The words landed in the lobby the way certain words do not loudly, but with a precision that made them impossible to mishear. One of the two men gave a short, uncomfortable laugh, the kind that is less about finding something funny and more about not knowing what else to do. A nearby security guard stared at the floor. A young woman who had just come through the door pretended to look at her phone. Angela did not move. She did not look up immediately. She held the mop handle with both hands and let the silence stretch for exactly as long as it needed to, and then she looked at him, not with anger, not with hurt, but with a calm, clear, level gaze that lasted only a moment, before she turned back to her work. Marcus took this as confirmation. He had said something sharp and clever. The woman had had no response, and the matter was closed. He continued toward the elevator, resuming his sentence to the two men, as though the exchange had been a minor detour, a small demonstration of the kind of frank efficiency he brought to every environment he occupied. He did not think about it again for the rest of the morning. He had a full schedule, 2 internal reviews, a pitch call, a lunch reservation, and the woman with the mop was not part of any of it. Angela finished the scuff mark. She wrung out the mop, repositioned the wet floor sign, and moved to the next section of the lobby. Her face gave nothing away, but in her mind, she noted the date, the time, and the exact words that had been said. She had a habit of noting things. By midday, Marcus had worked himself into a particular mood, the kind that arrives when a morning goes slightly better than expected and produces not gratitude but an appetite for control. The pitch call had gone well. One of the investors had made a comment he was still replaying with satisfaction. And now, standing at the glass window of his 19th floor office, looking down at the street below, he found himself returning to the moment in the lobby with a renewed sense of irritation. Not because he felt bad about it, because he felt the situation was unresolved. A cleaning woman had been in his lobby, his building, as he thought of it, though he had no ownership stake in it, looking disheveled, smelling of chemicals, presenting exactly the wrong image for a company like Viridian Solutions, which prided itself on an environment of excellence. He picked up his phone and called Derek Hollis, the building's operations manager, a mild-mannered man of 50 who had worked in building management for over 2 decades and whose primary professional skill was the careful navigation of unreasonable requests from tenants. Derek, Marcus said, without preamble, the cleaning crew in the lobby this morning. There was a woman there during peak arrival hours. That's not acceptable. I had clients walking in. Derek, who had dealt with Marcus before, chose his words with the precision of someone diffusing something. He explained that early morning cleaning was scheduled to minimize disruption to normal business hours, that the woman in question was one of their most dependable staff members, that the schedule had been approved by. I want her removed, Marcus said. Not reassigned, removed. If she's still in this building tomorrow morning, I'll be having a very different kind of conversation with your management team about whether this is still the right location for Viridian Solutions. There was a long pause on the other end. I'll need to escalate this, Derek said carefully. Escalate it then, Marcus said. But I want a resolution today. He ended the call and returned to his window. Below, on the street, a food delivery cyclist was waiting at a red light. Marcus watched him for a moment, with the vague contempt of someone who has decided that the gap between himself and everyone else is a measure of his worth. Angela received the formal notice at 2:37 in the afternoon, delivered in person by Derek, who came to find her in the supply closet on the second floor, where she was restocking her cart. He looked deeply uncomfortable. He held the paper in both hands, as though it weighed more than it should. He apologized 3 times before he finished explaining. He told her it was not his decision. He told her he thought it was wrong. He told her he was sorry. Angela took the paper, read it, folded it once along its crease, and tucked it into the front pocket of her uniform. She looked at Derek with an expression that was difficult to read. Not distress, not anger, something quieter and more considered than either. Thank you for telling me yourself, she said. I appreciate that. Derek blinked. He had expected tears, or an argument, or, at minimum, some visible sign of distress. He had not expected to be thanked. He walked back to his office feeling, obscurely, as though he was the one who had been dismissed. Angela took off her cap, smoothed her hair, and reached for her personal phone. She made 2 calls. The first lasted 40 seconds. The second lasted less than a minute. After the second call, she gathered her personal items from the supply closet. A small tote bag, a thermos, a spare pair of gloves, placed them in her cart, and wheeled the cart back to its designated storage area. She checked that everything was in order, that the supplies were organized and the cart was clean, and then she left the building through the main entrance, walking through the lobby with her usual measured pace. She did not rush. She did not look back. What Derek Hollis did not know, what Marcus Reed did not know, what virtually no one in the building knew was that within 40 minutes of Angela's departure, the building's senior management had received an urgent notification. Within the hour, 3 members of the ownership board had been contacted directly, and by 5 o'clock that afternoon, a meeting had been scheduled for the following morning. Not an ordinary meeting. An emergency convening of the property's ownership committee, called by its majority stakeholder. Marcus arrived at Meridian Tower the next morning, at exactly 8:45, as always. He was in a reasonable mood. The situation had been handled. The building had been reminded of its obligations to its tenants. These were the kinds of small enforcements that kept environments running properly, and he felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed he had simply maintained standards. He crossed the lobby without looking at the area near the far wall where the scuff mark had been. He rode the elevator to 19, exchanged brief words with his assistant about the day's schedule, and was informed, somewhere around 9:15, that there was a meeting at 10 o'clock in the building's boardroom. On the 22nd floor, a routine lease discussion, his assistant said. The kind of thing that came up quarterly and required his signature and about 45 minutes of his time. He was slightly annoyed by the short notice, but not particularly concerned. He had been through these conversations before. He knew how to handle building management. He arrived on the 22nd floor at 2 minutes to 10, was shown into the boardroom by a woman he did not recognize and stopped just inside the door. The room was configured around a long oval table. 5 people were already seated, 3 of them members of the building's management and ownership board. One of them, a legal counsel he recognized from previous lease negotiations, and one of them, at the head of the table, in the chair that was positioned with its back to the window and its face to the door, was Angela Brooks. She was not in her gray uniform. She wore a dark blazer over a white shirt, with small pearl earrings and reading glasses pushed up above her forehead. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, beside a legal pad and a thin leather portfolio. She looked, in every possible way, exactly like someone who belonged at the head of that table. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment that felt, to everyone in the room, considerably longer than it actually was. He looked at Angela. He looked at the people around the table, several of whom had risen slightly from their seats in the formal acknowledgement of someone they respected. He looked back at Angela. His face went through several changes, none of them smooth. "Please sit down, Mr. Reed," Angela said. Her voice was the same voice she had always had, unhurried, even, carrying no special weight of triumph or anger. She gestured to the chair across from her. "We have a number of things to discuss." Marcus sat down. The building's legal counsel, a composed woman named Patricia Walsh, opened a folder and began to speak. She explained that the meeting had been called at the request of the building's majority stakeholder, who held a controlling interest in the ownership consortium that operated Meridian Tower. She noted that this stakeholder had recently been the subject of an incident involving a tenant, and that the stakeholder had requested this meeting to address several matters related to the existing and upcoming lease agreements involving Viridian Solutions. Then Patricia turned slightly toward the head of the table and said, "I'll let Miss Brooks explain her position directly." Angela took off her reading glasses. She set them beside the legal pad. She looked at Marcus with the same clear, direct gaze she had directed at him the morning before, in the lobby, when he had said what he said with the full expectation of consequence for no one but her. "I own a majority stake in this building," she said. "I have for the past 6 years. I don't publicize it, and I don't use it as an introduction, which is why you didn't know, but I think it's relevant now." She paused. "I also think you remember what you said to me yesterday morning." Marcus said nothing. The silence in the room was of a specific and uncomfortable quality, the silence of people who are waiting to see what a man does when the architecture of his certainties collapses without warning. Angela spoke for the next 20 minutes. She spoke about the building, about the terms of the upcoming lease renewal, about several clauses that had been flagged for renegotiation. She spoke about the building's standards of conduct for tenants, about the formal complaint that had been filed following the events of the previous morning, about the documentation that had been collected. She spoke about all of it with the same measured composure she brought to every conversation, and she did not once raise her voice, and she did not once look away from Marcus with anything other than the steady attention of someone conducting business. At one point, near the end of her remarks, she set down her pen. She looked at him directly and said, "You evaluated me by a smell and decided it told you something true about a person's worth. I'm curious whether you apply that same standard to yourself. Whether you've ever looked at the way you treat people and let that tell you something true about who you are." The room remained very quiet. Marcus opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the table. He looked at Patricia Walsh, who was making a small, careful note on her legal pad and offering him nothing. He looked at the 2 board members, who had the expressions of people who had expected this, and were now simply watching it proceed. He was not a man who apologized easily. He had spent years building an identity around the idea that strength and directness were synonymous, that softening your words was the same as weakening your position. But sitting in that room, across from a woman whose quiet authority was more total than anything he had ever manufactured with a tailored suit and a sharp remark, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt small, not in the way he made others feel small as a deliberate diminishment, a reminder of hierarchy, but small in the way that the truth makes you feel small when it arrives without any room to maneuver around it. "I was wrong," he said finally. The words came out stiffly, like something that had been stored in an unfamiliar part of himself. "What I said was wrong." Angela looked at him for a moment. She nodded once, not with forgiveness, not with satisfaction, but with the acknowledgement of someone who has heard what she needed to hear and is ready to move forward. "Thank you," she said. "Now let's talk about the lease." The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. By the end of it, the terms had been laid out clearly. The preferential rate that Viridian Solutions had enjoyed for the past 3 years would not be renewed on the same terms. The new agreement would include a conduct clause, a formal document, reviewed by both parties' legal teams, that outlined behavioral standards expected of all tenant representatives, including executives. The existing contract would be honored to its end date, but going forward, the relationship would operate on different terms. Angela had not evicted them. She had not issued threats or ultimatums. She had simply, with great precision, adjusted the conditions under which they were welcome to remain. Word travels in buildings the way water travels through old pipes quietly, and through paths that are not immediately obvious, but with a thoroughness that eventually reaches everywhere. By the end of that day, the story had moved through Meridian Tower, in the way stories do when they are too extraordinary to stay contained. Not in its full detail, Angela was careful about what she shared and with whom, but in its broad shape. The woman in the lobby had turned out to be not what she appeared. The CEO had made a serious miscalculation. The meeting on the 22nd floor had not gone the way anyone expected, except perhaps the person who had called it. Within Viridian Solutions, the effect was more specific and more immediate. Several employees who had witnessed the lobby incident the morning before began to speak about it openly. A senior developer named James, who had been at the elevator bank when Marcus made his remark, sent a message to two colleagues saying simply that he had seen what had happened, and that he thought it was wrong, and that he had said nothing at the time, and he regretted that. One of those colleagues forwarded it to someone on the leadership team. By the following afternoon, 3 formal complaints had been filed with the company's human resources director, not about the incident with Angela, but about other incidents, some of them months old, that had been waiting for a moment that felt safe enough to surface. The incident in the lobby had not been the first time Marcus had spoken that way. It had simply been the first time it had happened in a context where the ground beneath him was less stable than he had assumed. The human resources director, a woman named Sandra Cho, who had privately documented her own concerns about Marcus for over a year, took the complaints seriously. She escalated them to the board of directors of Viridian Solutions, a 5-person board that had, for years, overlooked Marcus's behavioral patterns because his financial results had made the oversight feel unnecessary. But the financial results had been softening for 2 quarters. The new lease terms had added meaningful cost to the operating budget, and the complaints, arriving in a cluster, carried a weight they might not have carried individually. The board convened a special session. The session lasted 4 hours. Marcus was not invited to attend. The formal announcement came 11 days later. Marcus Reed would be transitioning out of his role as Chief Executive Officer of Viridian Solutions, effective at the end of the quarter. The language of the announcement was careful and corporate, pursuing new opportunities, mutual decision, grateful for his contributions. But the people inside the company who had lived through the past several years read it with a clarity that the official language did not intend to provide. The contributions were not in dispute. The problem had never been the results. The problem had been the cost at which those results were obtained, and the culture that had taken root in the obtaining of them. Marcus sat in his office on the evening after the announcement, after most of his employees had gone home, after his assistant had quietly packed her bag and said goodnight, with an expression that was carefully neutral. He sat at his desk and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass, at the lights coming on in buildings across the skyline, and he thought about the story he had been telling himself for the past several years, the story in which his success was entirely the product of his own exceptional qualities, in which the people who had not succeeded as he had were responsible for their own condition, in which the world was organized around a logic of deserving that placed him, reliably, in the place that deserved the most. He thought about Angela Brooks, sitting at the head of that table with her reading glasses and her folded hands, looking at him with an expression that contained no malice, no revenge, no gloating, just clarity. The clarity of someone who had never needed his approval, had never needed anyone to believe in her potential, had simply built the thing she had set out to build and waited to see what the world would reveal about itself in the meantime. And the world had revealed Marcus Reed. Angela Brooks had grown up in a small house in a neighborhood that people described, when they described it at all, with the careful neutrality of people trying not to say something unkind. Her father had worked at a distribution center. Her mother had cleaned offices. They had not had very much, but they had been deliberate with what they had, careful about money, careful about time, careful about the lessons they passed on to their daughter. Her mother, in particular, had a philosophy that she stated plainly and often, that a person's character was not determined by what they had, but by what they did with what they had, and by how they treated the people around them, regardless of what those people could offer in return. Angela had grown up watching her mother clean other people's buildings, with a care and thoroughness that made no distinction between the rooms that were noticed and the rooms that were not. She had worked through high school and through college, managing a coursework schedule and a part-time job with the efficiency of someone who understood that neither could be sacrificed. She had graduated with a degree in business administration and a specific interest in real estate finance, having identified early that property ownership was a reliable path to accumulated wealth in a way that salary income alone rarely was. She had worked for a commercial real estate firm for 4 years, learning the industry from the inside, understanding how buildings were valued and how leases were structured, and where the leverage actually lived in a property negotiation. And then, with the savings she had accumulated and the knowledge she had built, she had begun to buy. Not aggressively, not all at once carefully, the way her parents had taught her to do things, with attention to the details that others skimmed over. Her first acquisition had been a modest commercial property in a neighborhood that more established investors had written off as past its prime. She had seen something different in the numbers. She had been right. The second acquisition had come 2 years later, larger and more complex. By the time she purchased her stake in Meridian Tower, she was 30 years old, and she had been doing this long enough to know that the real work of ownership was not the signing of documents or the negotiation of prices, but the ongoing, day-to-day understanding of what a property actually was, how it functioned, what it needed, who it served, and how the people inside it related to each other. That understanding was not something that could be obtained from a management report or a quarterly financial summary. It required presence. It required observation. And it required, she had decided, the particular kind of invisibility that came with being the person no one thought to look at twice. She had cleared the arrangement with the building's existing operations team, sworn them to confidentiality, and spent roughly 15 hours a week in the building for the past 20 months. She had learned a great deal. She had seen the building's culture in the unguarded moments that a property owner visiting in an official capacity never gets to see. She had watched how people treated the support staff, which was one of the truest measures she knew of institutional character. She had watched how the different tenant companies conducted themselves in shared spaces. She had made notes. She had been patient. She had been waiting to see what the picture would look like when it was complete. And then one morning, Marcus Reed had walked through the lobby with 2 clients, paused near her cart, and said what he said. He had not known he was speaking to the person who held the power to reshape his entire professional situation. But Angela had not needed that knowledge to inform how she felt about what he said. The words had been wrong before she knew who Marcus Reed was. They had been wrong when her mother had heard similar words while cleaning similar lobbies. They had been wrong every time they had been said to every person who had stood in that position, holding that equipment, and been told by someone passing through that they smelled like something shameful. She had not filed the complaint and called the emergency meeting because he had said it to her specifically. She had done it because it needed to be said to someone that it was not acceptable, and she happened to be in the position to say it in a way that would be heard. She had no interest in destroying Marcus Reed. That had never been the point. The point was accountability. The simple and often radical proposition that the consequences for one's behavior should not depend entirely on one's position in a perceived hierarchy. That what you say to the person cleaning the floor should carry the same weight as what you say in the boardroom, because the character demonstrated in both rooms is the same character. She had made her position clear. She had adjusted the terms. She had allowed the natural weight of the situation to do what it would do. And then she had returned to her work. Several weeks after the announcement of Marcus's departure, on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, Angela arrived at Meridian Tower at her customary time. She had decided to continue her arrangement with the building, not as frequently, perhaps, but still occasionally, still in the same capacity. She had thought carefully about whether the incident had changed the meaning of being there, and she had concluded that it had not. The reason she had chosen this work had not been about secrecy or concealment. It had been about understanding. And the circumstances of understanding had not changed simply because more people now knew who she was. The lobby was quiet when she arrived. She signed in, collected her cart, and began her rounds. The marble floor had a section near the main entrance that caught dirt particularly easily on rainy mornings, and the previous day had been wet, so she started there. She was working steadily, the mop moving in its familiar arc, when a young man she had not seen before came hurrying through the revolving door, carrying a stack of bound reports and a coffee that was clearly his second of the morning. He was moving too quickly for the wet floor, and he caught the edge of her cart with his shoulder, sending a full cup of water into a spreading puddle across 6 square feet of marble. He froze. His face went through the rapid succession of emotions that faces go through in the moment between doing something and knowing whether there will be consequences for it. He was perhaps 24, new to the building, or new to this particular route, and his expression as he looked at the water, and then at Angela, was the expression of someone preparing for something bad to happen. "I'm so sorry," he said. I'm really sorry. I wasn't watching where I was." "It's fine," Angela said. She had already reached for the dry mop. "It happens." She began to move the water toward the drain along the far wall, working efficiently, and the young man stood for a moment in a confusion of relief and residual guilt, and then he set his reports down on the nearby reception ledge and reached for the second dry mop that was hanging from the side of the cart. "Let me help," he said. Angela looked at him. He was already moving the mop across the floor with the awkward but earnest effort of someone who had never actually mopped a floor but was making a genuine attempt. She watched him for a moment. Then she showed him the correct grip handle, lower, wider stance. Let the mop do the work. He adjusted. They worked the water toward the drain together, and after a few minutes the floor was clean and dry, and the wet floor signs were repositioned, and the young man collected his reports from the ledge and looked at Angela with an expression that had nothing in it but straightforward gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. "Watch the entrance on rainy days. It catches everything." He nodded and went toward the elevator, and Angela watched him go, and then she turned back to the lobby and continued her work. The morning light was coming through the tall glass panels in the particular way it did in autumn, lower and more golden than in summer, spreading across the marble in long, warm rectangles. The building was beginning to fill, with the first arrivals of the day, the early ones, the earnest ones, the people who came before they had to, because they wanted to start ahead of the noise. She recognized several of them. She nodded to a few. She continued moving, steady and unhurried, through the familiar space. There is a version of this story in which the point is the reversal in which Angela's power is revealed as the punchline and Marcus's humiliation is the destination. That version is satisfying in the way that certain stories are satisfying, with the clean architecture of a wrong made right and a score settled and a lesson delivered. But it misses what is most interesting about what actually happened. Marcus Reed lost his position not because Angela punished him. He lost it because the things he had done had been real all along, and the conditions that had allowed them to continue had finally shifted. The people who had watched him for years and said nothing had found their voices. The board that had weighed his results against his conduct and found the results sufficient had reweighed and found them no longer so. The building that he had treated as an extension of his own authority had turned out to be someone else's, someone who had a different idea about what authority meant and how it should be used. And Angela had continued. She had continued because that was her nature, and because the work, all of it, the work of building the portfolio, the work of understanding the properties from the inside, the work of showing up before 6 and mopping the floor and watching how people moved through the spaces she owned was not something she did despite having power. It was something she did because of how she understood power, not as a thing to be displayed, but as a thing to be used carefully, and sometimes not displayed at all. The truest measure of a person, she believed, was not what they did when everyone was watching and the stakes were high and the recognition was assured. It was what they did in the ordinary moments, in the unremarkable Tuesday mornings, in the encounters that no one would remember or record or reward. It was whether you helped a young man mop up water he had spilled in a lobby, not because it reflected well on you, but because it was what needed doing and you were there to do it. It was whether you maintained, through the long accumulation of small moments, the same character you would want to be remembered by in the large ones. Marcus had failed this. Not once, but many times, in many rooms, over many years. The morning in the lobby with the two clients had not been an aberration. It had been a revelation, a moment in which something that had always been true about him had become visible to the right person at the right time. That was all. The fall had not been caused by one bad sentence. The fall had been waiting, with the patient inevitability of things that are simply the logical conclusion of their own nature. Angela walked the mop through the last section of the lobby floor. The marble caught the autumn light and gave it back in long, pale reflections. At the elevator bank, a small cluster of people waited with the practiced patience of people who do this every morning. None of them looked at her. This was fine. She was not there to be looked at. She was there because she had chosen to be, and because the work mattered, and because she had never once confused being overlooked with being without value. She had learned that a long time ago, in a house that did not have very much, and understood perfectly well what it had. Character, she had come to believe, was not revealed by how you treated people above you, those who had something you wanted, those who held power over your advancement, those whose approval you were seeking. Anyone could manage that. Character was revealed in the unguarded moments, in how you spoke to the person who could do nothing for you, in what you said when you thought no one important was listening, in whether the version of yourself that appeared in the lobby at 8:45 in the morning was the same version that appeared in the boardroom on the 22nd floor. Some people were the same in both places. Some people were very different. And the difference, over time, became the story. The lobby was clean. The floor caught the light. Angela Brooks placed the mop back on its hook, steadied the cart, and moved toward the next floor. The days that followed Marcus Reed's departure from Viridian Solutions were the kind of days that people who have never fallen from a significant height tend to underestimate. It was not simply the loss of a title or a corner office or the matte black sedan that had been a company vehicle. It was the loss of the architecture of the self, the entire scaffolding of identity that had been built around a position, a reputation, a particular way of moving through rooms and being regarded by the people in them. Without that scaffolding, the ordinary world had an unfamiliar texture. The coffee shop near his apartment, where the staff had always recognized him from the press coverage of Viridian's growth and occasionally comped his order, now treated him like anyone else. The invitations to industry panels and speaking engagements, which had arrived with reliable frequency, slowed and then stopped. The network that had formed around his success, not friends exactly, but the surrounding constellation of people whose interest in him had been proportional to his utility, contracted sharply. He had been at the center of something. Now, he was in the periphery of it. He spent the first month doing the things that people in his position typically do, talking to lawyers, reviewing documents, having conversations with his board that were professionally cordial and emotionally hollow. He hired a communications consultant to help him manage the transition narrative. He had conversations with headhunters about what might come next. He did all the practical things. But at night, in the particular quiet of an apartment that had been designed to impress visitors, and had never quite managed to feel like a place where a person actually lived, he returned to the room on the 22nd floor. He returned to Angela's face across the table, and the question she had asked him, and the silence that had followed it. He was not a man given to extended self-examination. He had always found the impulse toward introspection to be a form of self-indulgence, a luxury of people who had not yet found something more urgent to do with their attention. But that question had installed itself somewhere he could not locate and could not dislodge. Whether you've ever looked at the way you treat people and let that tell you something true about who you are, he kept turning it over. The answer, when he was honest with himself, was that he had not. He had looked at results. He had looked at outcomes. He had looked at numbers and contracts and market share. He had not looked at that. He thought about the employees whose names he had known, but whose lives he had never bothered to understand. He thought about the woman at the plant watering service, who had smiled at him for 4 years, and whose name he had never once asked. He thought about the junior analyst, David, he thought, or possibly Daniel, whom he had publicly berated in a team meeting over a forecasting error that had, in hindsight, been caused by a data input error 2 levels above David or Daniel's involvement. He thought about the people who had filed the complaints that had ultimately reached the board, and he understood that they had not invented their grievances to take advantage of a moment of vulnerability. They had been waiting for the moment to feel safe enough, and the moment had finally arrived. That recognition carried its own particular weight. Not quite guilt, but something in the same family. The awareness of a gap between who he had believed himself to be and who the evidence suggested he actually was. He did not transform. That would be the wrong word and the wrong expectation. People do not transform in months, and the kind of change that is real and durable does not announce itself. But something shifted. Some of the certainty that had made him so clean and so quick in his judgments began to develop a hesitation at its edges. A small but genuine pause before the reflex fired, a moment of reconsideration that had not existed before. Whether that pause would grow, whether it would eventually reshape something fundamental in how he moved through the world, was not a question anyone could yet answer. That story was still being written, and it would be written in the accumulation of small decisions that no one would notice and that he would have to make for his own reasons, with no audience and no applause. Angela knew none of this because it was not information that reached her. She had not asked to be informed of Marcus Reed's internal life, and she would not have considered it her concern if she had been. She had said what she needed to say. She had done what needed to be done. The rest was not hers to carry. What she did know, and what mattered more to her practical situation, was that Meridian Tower was entering a period of renewal. Several of the lease agreements that had existed in various states of inertia for years were now being renegotiated on clearer terms. The building's operations team, energized by the clarity of the new direction, was bringing a level of attention to maintenance and standards that had been inconsistent under the previous management culture. There was something Angela had observed over the years that she found consistently true. When the leadership of a place treated its workers well, the workers treated the place well, and the place itself, over time, became noticeably better. Not just in the metrics that showed up in quarterly reports, but in the quality of the air, the frequency of small problems being caught before they became large ones, the invisible thousand ways in which a building either worked or did not work, that had everything to do with whether the people maintaining it believed their work was seen. The new cleaning supervisor, a man named George Tillman, who had been with the building for 11 years and had waited a long time for the authority that had now been extended to him, ran his department with the quiet pride of someone who had been entrusted with something real. He knew Angela's arrangement. He was one of the few people in the building who had known from the beginning. He had never said a word about it, not out of fear, but out of genuine respect for what she was trying to understand. He thought it was a remarkable thing, what she had done. He had told her so once, early on, and she had said that her mother had done the same work for 30 years and deserved the same respect as anyone, and that she intended to make sure that the buildings she owned were places where that was true. George Tillman had gone back to his office and thought about that for a long time. There is a particular kind of authority that does not require display, that exists independently of the rooms it enters, that is not diminished by silence, and not enlarged by volume. It is the authority of someone who knows, with absolute certainty, both what they have built and why they built it, and who does not need anyone else to confirm the value of either. Angela Brooks had this. She had built it over years, in the same way she had built everything else carefully, without shortcuts, with attention to the parts that no one was watching. It made her, in many of the rooms she entered, the most powerful person present, and in a significant number of those rooms, no one knew it until they needed to. She continued to serve on several boards, to review quarterly reports, to make decisions about acquisitions and developments that would play out over years. She continued to return to Meridian Tower on certain mornings, less frequently now, but with the same intention she had always brought. She continued to arrive before the city was fully awake, to sign in at the security desk, to work through the lobby, with a focus that had nothing performative in it, only the simple satisfaction of work done well. She continued to notice things, the way the entrance tracked weather on its floors, the way the afternoon light moved through the atrium, the way certain people softened when they thought no one of consequence was watching and others stiffened, the way a building could be read, over time, like a long and complicated face. On a morning in late October, Angela stood at the window of her own office, not in Meridian Tower, but in a smaller building she owned 2 miles north, where she kept a quiet workspace above a bakery that filled the stairwell with the smell of cardamom on weekday mornings. She was reviewing a proposal for a new acquisition, a warehouse property in a neighborhood that was changing in ways that interested her. The numbers were good. The location was better than the price reflected. She made a note in the margin and set the proposal aside for the afternoon. Outside the window, the city moved through its morning with the indifferent energy that cities always have: the buses running, the people walking, the light adjusting itself to the season. Down on the street below, a delivery truck was idling at the curb, and the driver had gotten out to make a delivery, and in doing so had blocked a narrow stretch of sidewalk, and a woman pushing a stroller was waiting patiently for the delivery to be completed, and then the driver saw her, and moved with obvious urgency to clear the path, and the woman smiled and thanked him, and he nodded and went back to his truck. It was a 10-second exchange. No one would remember it. It would not make its way into any account of anyone's day. But it had been the right thing, done at the right moment, without audience and without calculation. And Angela, who had always been a careful observer of human behavior, watched it and thought about her mother and about the long list of ordinary moments that added up, over a life, to the truest account of who a person was. She turned back to her desk. She had work to do,